The sun was setting like a dying fire behind the mountains when they found her. Her dress, once white as promise, was torn at the hem, stained with dust and blood. In her hand, she still clutched the locket he had given her, a simple thing, tarnished now by the storm. A few paces away, his hat lay crushed in the mud, but he was nowhere to be seen. The sheriff muttered something about cowards under his breath, but the old-timers just shook their heads. They knew better. No drifter could cause this much heartache, unless he carried a heavier kind of burden. A burden like owning half, the state, and a heart he'd locked away for a lifetime. They said she should have seen it coming. They said she should have stayed away from him. But love doesn't listen to warnings. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something. 97% of the people who listen to my stories never subscribe. If even a small part of today's story touches your heart, please consider subscribing. It's free for you, but it means the world to me. Now, let's continue. The town of Dry Creek wasn't built on kindness. It rose out of dust and stubbornness, stitched together by men who carried rifles to church and women who learned early how to hide bruises with lace. In Dry Creek, a name wasn't given. It was earned, and hers had long since been lost to a whisper. They called her the widow, though she had never worn a proper black veil. Some said it was bad luck that followed her like a second shadow. Others, in tighter circles, muttered that her limp was punishment from God himself. No one ever asked her what the truth was. The wooden planks of Main Street groaned under her boots as she passed, and the shopkeepers who had been laughing a moment ago now busied themselves, adjusting shelves that didn't need adjusting, wiping dust from counters that would never be clean. Children, sharp-eyed and mean like their fathers, pointed at the twisted scar along her jaw and giggled until their mothers yanked them away. She said nothing. She never did. Her world was measured in silences, the long, yawning hush of sunrise when she sat alone on her porch, staring at the emptiness beyond the hills, the cold quiet of the church pews when she dared to slip into the back row, only to be stared down by women who had been praying for her soul for years, the unbearable stillness of her little room at the boarding house, one window, one bed, no letters ever arriving at the door. Pain had long ago stopped feeling like fire. Now it was a dull, dragging thing, like the weight of wet clothes in a river current. She carried it the way her body carried the limp, without thinking, without hope of healing. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when she could laugh, though now the memory of her own laughter felt like something she'd borrowed and lost. Back then, before the fever took her husband, before the townsfolk began to avoid her like a sickness they could catch just by meeting her eye. Back when she still believed a second chance could ride into town on a stranger's horse. She'd almost given up on that foolish dream the morning she first saw him, leaning against the corral fence, a battered hat tipped low over his eyes, a smile that wasn't meant for anyone but himself. She didn't know his name then. Nobody did. They called him a drifter, like they called anyone who looked like trouble but hadn't proved it yet. And trouble, Dry Creek had taught her, always came dressed in charm and dust. If this is breaking your heart already, you haven't seen the worst yet. Tap subscribe. I've got another truth waiting for you tomorrow. There was something different about him, though. Something quieter. He didn't swagger like the ranch boys or shout like the traders in the saloon. He moved slow, like a man who wasn't afraid of silence or of being alone. She told herself to look away, to tighten the bolt on the door she'd built around her heart. But it was already too late. It wasn't the way he looked at her that did it. It was the way he didn't. He didn't flinch at her scar. He didn't glance down at her limp. He didn't shift awkwardly, the way even the preacher did when forced to shake her hand. To him, she was just another face in a world full of broken things, and he didn't seem the least bit afraid of broken things. For the first time in years, she felt something stir. Not hope. Hope was dangerous. It was something older, deeper. Like a match sparking in a dark, abandoned cabin. Maybe it was foolishness. Maybe it was loneliness. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the first step toward a story neither of them knew they were already trapped inside. The day the wind changed, she knew before she stepped onto the porch. It carried something different, not the dry, scratchy heat of dust season, nor the iron tang of rain. This wind smelled like sweat and horses, and long miles behind a man who wasn't afraid of the road. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, even though the sun was still high. Habit, not cold, made her hide the scar that ran like a broken river from her cheekbone to her neck. He was there again, by the corral this time, elbows slung over the top rail, watching the colts kick up little whirlwinds of dust. The same. Battered hat shaded his face, but when he turned slightly, she caught the barest flash of his eyes. Blue, like creek water over white stone. He didn't look away when he saw her. Didn't pretend she wasn't there like the others did. Instead, his mouth tipped up at one corner. Not a smile exactly, but not mockery either. It startled her more than a gunshot would have. Inside the general store, Mrs. Hargreaves was pretending to rearrange sacks of flour. Her mouth tightened to a hard line the moment she saw the stranger, and tighter still when she caught the widow looking back. Danger, the look said. Men who didn't belong brought trouble, and trouble always bled into things you couldn't wash clean. She ducked her head and went inside, pretending she needed kerosene or sugar, but her hands fumbled clumsily at the shelves. Outside, the stranger spoke. It wasn't much, just a low greeting to the blacksmith who was hammering away, ignoring him, but his voice, it rumbled deep and easy, like it belonged here even if he didn't. The bell above the door jingled as he pushed inside. The floorboards creaked under. His boots, slow, heavy steps that somehow felt too loud in the close, musty air. She could feel him without looking, the way you feel a summer storm coming before you see the clouds. He passed her in the narrow aisle, close enough that the edge of his duster brushed against her skirt, close enough that she could smell leather and dust and something sharper underneath, whiskey maybe, or old regret. He tipped his hat slightly as he passed. Not a word, just a small, careful acknowledgement. And somehow, it was more than anyone in this town had offered her in years. She fumbled the kerosene jug and nearly dropped it. By the time she got her hands steady again, he was at the counter, exchanging a few words with old man Bickley, who was pretending not to scowl as he took the stranger's money. "Where you headed?" Bickley asked, voice thin and suspicious. The stranger shrugged. "Nowhere urgent." "Passing through, then?" "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not." Bickley didn't like that answer. Neither did the handful of loafers hunched near the pickle barrels, who had been eavesdropping as openly as pigs at a trough. The widow stayed frozen in the aisle, heart thudding a little too fast. She knew what Dry Creek did to men who didn't fit the mold. It chewed them up. Or worse, it drove them to chew up someone else just to stay standing. She couldn't explain why she didn't want that to happen to this man. She didn't know him. Didn't owe him anything. And yet, there was something about the easy way he faced them all, calm as a man waiting for a train that would never come. Maybe it was that he didn't seem angry. Maybe it was that he didn't seem scared. Or maybe it was that he didn't look at her like a warning. When he left the store, he didn't linger. Just stepped back into the white heat of the street, leading his horse, a big dapple gray with scars of its own down one flank. She watched him go, a tightness blooming in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a longing she thought she'd buried. That night, at the boarding house, the whispers started. Low, oily things carried from the porch to the parlor, Mrs. Hargreaves shaking her head in righteous judgment. Young Mrs. Talbot murmuring, "He'll break her if he don't get himself shot first." They all assumed the same thing, that a man like him, handsome and easy smiling, must be a gambler or a cattle thief or worse. Nobody imagined he could be anything else. Because in Dry Creek, people weren't allowed to be complicated. You were either good or bad, and once the town had decided which you were, there was no crossing back. The widow sat by the window that night, lamp turned low, watching the dark street, listening to the old wooden bones of the town creak in the wind. Somewhere out there he was bedding down in a lean-to, or maybe in the empty barn by the creek, She wondered if he slept as easily as he moved, if he dreamed of anything at all. The scar along her jaw ached when she thought too long, a ghost pain of a life that used to be full of dreams. She pressed her fingers to it absently, a habit she hated. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow, he'll be gone. Men like that never stayed, and women like her were never worth the trouble of looking back. Still, when she finally lay down, she dreamed of horses running across the desert. Of blue, eyes flashing in the sun, of someone somewhere, looking at her and seeing more than a limp, more than a curse, just her. 3 days after the stranger came to town, they decided to remind her who she was. It happened in the square, in front of God and everybody. Market day brought out all the town's best intentions, and its worst cruelties. She should have known, better than to show up at all. But Miss Clara at the boarding house had begged her to fetch sewing thread, and there was no arguing with Clara once she got it into her mind. The widow kept her head down, her shawl pulled high, her steps slow and careful, but even so she felt the stares, heard the wet snickers, felt the malice that hung in the heat like a swarm of wasps. It wasn't until she stepped onto the mercantile porch that she saw it, a scrap of paper nailed right to the post, a crude drawing, a limping woman with a wild, jagged scar and a noose drawn around her neck. Underneath, in rough, childish handwriting, hexed widow. Bad luck. Laughter exploded from the crowd. Men tipping back their hats, women pretending to look away but not missing a thing. Children laughing, high and cruel, with the sharp joy of the unpunished. The widow froze. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She just stood there, her heart a hammer, in her chest, her face burning so hot it felt like it would melt her skin clean off. Someone muttered, thought she knew better than to show her face. Another voice, half drunk already, slurred, might be that drifter'll catch her curse. That broke them. The whole porch shook with laughter. Her hands shook. Her knees, always weak, nearly gave out. She didn't remember turning, didn't remember stumbling off the porch, the hem of her skirt catching on splintered wood. Didn't remember her boots slipping in the street dust. She just ran like she hadn't since before the limp, before the scar, before life had taught her that running didn't fix a damn thing. Past the saloon, past the livery, out into the open fields where the grass turned brittle and yellow under the summer sun. She didn't stop until her chest was clawing for breath, and her bad leg gave. Out. She fell hard, scraping her palms raw on the dry ground. The world spun. She curled into herself, arms wrapped tight, dirt biting into her skin, her heart beating a frantic, hopeless rhythm. It would be easier just to stay down, to disappear into the dust like a story no one bothered to finish. Maybe that was what she was meant for, nothing but brokenness and shame. She didn't hear him approach. No thundering hooves, no shouted name, just the soft crunch of boots in the dust, slow and careful. She braced for another humiliation, another blow, but it didn't come. Instead, a shadow fell over her, broad and solid. He crouched beside her, far enough not to crowd, her close enough that she could smell horse sweat and leather. He didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes, didn't reach for her like she was something he needed to fix. He just set something beside her, a folded cloth and a battered tin canteen, and then he sat down in the dirt. Silent, patient, as if telling her with his body alone, I'll be here. Take your time. Her throat tightened painfully. Slowly, clumsily, she pressed the cloth to her scraped palms, took a sip from the canteen, the water tasting like dust and life all at once. Only then did he speak, soft, almost a murmur. They're scared of what they don't understand. She stared at him, at the rough scars across his knuckles, at the lines of exhaustion carved into the corners of his eyes, at the way he sat, perfectly still, like he'd spent half his life waiting for things no one else thought were coming. They thought she was broken, but someone saw gold in the ashes. He said it like it was a truth, not a comfort. She laughed, a raw, broken thing that barely escaped her throat. Gold? She rasped. He shrugged, a slow, deliberate roll of one shoulder. Fire don't touch what's real, only burns away what don't matter. The breeze kicked up, tugging at the loose strands of her hair. She wanted to believe him. Lord, she wanted it so bad it hurt worse than the fall, but believing was dangerous. Hope was dangerous. I ain't gold, she said finally, voice low, just ash. He looked at her then, really looked. Not like the town did, not like her scars were a warning, like he was seeing through the ruin to something she couldn't even remember being. You're still standing, he said simply, and you ran faster than anyone else in this town could have. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. That's worth something. She stared at him, unblinking, waiting for the mockery that never came, waiting for the pity that didn't follow, only steady, patient kindness. The sun dipped lower, setting the dry grass on fire with gold and blood-red light. Finally, painfully, she pushed herself up. He didn't rush to help, only rose with her, easy and unhurried. She swayed once, dizzy, and for a brief moment, their hands brushed. He steadied her, not grabbing, not clutching. Just steadying, like a man who understood that trust wasn't something you could demand. It had to be earned, one heartbeat at a time. Together, they walked back toward town, slowly, silently, side by side. The first time they swung a hammer together, the boards nearly split under her hands. It was his idea. A place of their own, he said. Not much, a broken-down cabin on the edge of town, half swallowed by dust and loneliness. But to her it was more than wood and stone. It was a declaration. Are not what they say we are. He worked quietly, sleeves rolled up, muscles moving under sun-browned skin. She mirrored him as best she could, awkward at first, then steadier with every nail driven home. The townsfolk watched from afar, whispering from under tilted hats and behind curtained windows. They didn't dare stop them, but their disdain was thick enough to choke on. They'll burn it down soon as you turn your back, she said once, voice low as they hammered in the last window shutter. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Then we build again. Simple as that. Her chest tightened. Not with fear this time, but something sweeter. Something she hadn't let herself feel in a long, long time. Hope. The days bled into each other, hard and hot and golden. They fixed the roof, patched the chimney, mended the broken fence out back. Sometimes he talked, telling quiet stories of the places he'd been. Wild country, where the mountains clawed the sky and the rivers ran so fast you couldn't catch your breath. Other times they worked in silence, the kind that wasn't heavy but comfortable. She caught herself smiling once. Unguarded, caught him smiling back. It felt like a kind of rebellion in itself. The final blow came the way trouble always did in Dry Creek. Sudden, stupid, cruel. The sheriff, a lazy bully named Collier, came riding up one afternoon with 2 deputies flanking him. He didn't even bother to knock, just kicked his way through the half-hung door and stood in the half-built cabin like he owned the place. Got word, Collier drawled. You're harboring a wanted man. The widow froze where she stood, hand on the wash basin. The stranger, her stranger, didn't move, didn't flinch, only set down the plank he'd been sanding, slow and steady. What's the charge? He asked mildly. Collier smirked. Rustling, fraud, couple counts of assault. The widow's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to scream, to deny it, to fight. But the stranger only tilted his head slightly. Rustling, he repeated. That all? Collier's face darkened, realizing he wasn't scaring him. No trial needed. We run folks like you out of here. And her with me? He asked, voice too quiet. The sheriff shrugged. She chose her company. The widow felt her stomach twist. This was it. The old story, branded again, condemned for loving anything too wild or too real. She half expected him to walk away then. Leave her to the wolves. Instead, he stepped forward, placing himself between her and the lawman, without fanfare, without speeches, just a simple, silent choice. Us they fought in their way, not with fists, though the deputies looked eager enough for it, with defiance, with stubbornness, with the unspoken promise that they wouldn't be broken down again. Sheriff Collier huffed and spat in the dust. "Y'all don't leave by sundown," he said. "We'll light this place up with you inside." And he meant it. "Whadia?" Stranger watched them ride off, then turned to her. She expected anger, bitterness. Instead, he just smiled. Small, crooked, full of something fierce. "Still want to build a life?" he asked. Her throat tightened. She could run. She could hide, or she could stand with him. She nodded once, sharp and sure. They packed what little they had by the light of the sinking sun, loaded the mule with blankets and tools, left behind the half-built house, not as a surrender, but as a statement. You can't burn us out. You can't touch what we carry. They camped under the stars that night. Firelight flickering over worn faces and rough hands. He sat close, not touching her, just near enough that she could feel his warmth against her side. The fire popped, sending up sparks into the endless black sky. After a long, heavy silence, she asked, barely more than a whisper, was it true what he said? He didn't pretend not to understand. He stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "Once," he said, "I was angry, took what wasn't mine, tried to outrun it. And now? Now," he said, voice low and rough, "I want to build something that lasts longer than my mistakes." Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the coffee pot. He stilled her with just a look. No pressure, no demands, letting her choose. Slowly, she poured 2 cups, handed him one. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just acceptance, and it was enough. The next morning, they rode toward the high country, toward the broken ridges where the land rose up sharp and wild, a new place, a new start. She still limped, still wore her scars. He still carried his past, like an old wound that didn't ache as much as it used to. But between them was something fierce and stubborn and alive, a fire that no sheriff, no gossip, no cruel wind could put out. The town gathered for the hanging tree festival, an old tradition that had nothing to do with nooses anymore and everything to do with music, whiskey, and forgetting the hard months. The widow stood just outside the lamplight, shawl wrapped tight, watching from the shadows. She hadn't meant to come, had promised herself she wouldn't. But he was here, and something inside her ached to see it through. The townsfolk laughed and danced, pretending they didn't notice the stranger by the fire, the drifter who hadn't drifted on. Sheriff Collier watched too, jaw tight, thumb resting near the eye, butt of his pistol. Old anger still smoldering. They hadn't burned her cabin, but they hadn't forgotten her defiance either. The widow turned to go. She didn't need their approval, didn't need their false smiles. She had chosen her life. She had chosen him. And that was enough. She took one step toward the darkness, toward the fields, toward freedom. And his voice stopped her, clear, steady, louder than any shout. "I reckon. There's something I ought to say." The fiddles died out, one by one. The laughter fell into a stunned silence. The widow froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. He stood tall in the firelight, every scar and shadow carved into something almost holy. "I came here with dust on my boots and a past heavier than sin," he said, voice carrying over the stunned crowd. "I didn't expect much, didn't think I'd stay." His eyes found hers across the fire. And then I saw her. A ripple of whispers tore through the onlookers. Faces turned. The widow gripped the edges of her shawl until her knuckles went white. "Y'all called her cursed," he said, soft but clear. "Called her bad luck." He shook his head once, slow and sure. "But when I was lost, she was the one who lit the way home." The breath caught in her throat. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing just a few feet from her. No fear, no shame, only certainty. He held out his hand, rough, scarred, steady. "Stay," he said, a single word, a plea, a promise. She could feel the eyes on her, heavy and judging, feel the weight of every whispered name, every door slammed in her face. But she could also feel the fire between them, the thing they'd built out of broken pieces, the thing that refused to die. Slowly, she reached out, slipped her hand into his. And the whole town saw it, saw the widow and the drifter, standing together, not hiding, not ashamed, two battered souls choosing each other against the odds. The fiddler, bless his old stubborn heart, picked up his bow and played a low, aching tune. The rest of the world fell away. They didn't need a preacher or a paper, didn't need anyone's blessing. Under the wide, starlit sky, with nothing but the fire crackling and the song trembling on the wind, they made their vow. I see you. I choose you. Again and again. No witnesses but the stars. No gold rings, just the tight clasp of two hands that had weathered too many storms to ever let go again. They stayed, built a house with their own two hands, started a ranch, small but honest, planted wildflowers where the town's hate had once taken root. Folks still whispered, but it didn't matter. They had each other, and a little boy a few years later, wild as a colt and fierce as a sunrise, named after the man who had once left her broken and the man who had helped her rebuild. A strange name, a story stitched into every syllable, but it fit.